Hi, my name is Malusim Kize, and today we'll be looking at a series of videos, and beginning with this first one. We're going to be starting a topic of business assurance, and I guess before we go into it, let's first just define what the need is for business assurance, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. And then as we drill down to the different examples, we'll be defining again what we mean by the term business assurance, because it's just really a generic term. It's not necessarily a legal term that's defined. There's many terminologies out there, but I think the important thing is just to get on the same page and know what we're all talking about. So let's go. So one of the ways to measure economic growth in the economy is via GDP, gross domestic product. You basically measure the amount of goods and services that have been produced in any given year in an economy. Now, I think we can agree that in order to do that, the sustainability and the growth of business or companies is quite important. I think the issue is what happens if something happens to the actual individuals involved in that business, whether it be shareholders, whether it be directors. What happens if something that is unplanned happens, whether it's death, disability, a severe illness, or anything like that? What happens to that business? Now, clearly, that business is going to be affected. And if we allow that business to be affected to things that are unplanned, such as death, then we cannot achieve economic growth. So the whole idea is to try and keep that business sustainable so that it produces those goods and services so that people earn an income, etc., so that the economy is stable. So what we're going to be looking at is some of the needs that come up when a timely thing happens, like, for example, a severe illness. How do we actually make sure that because that has happened, we actually still keep the business sustainable? So that's what we're going to be looking at in an example. So in my example, we've got a married couple, Mr. King and Mrs. King, and they're married in community of property. And they have one daughter who is still a minor, and that's their beautiful house that they live in. Now, at this stage, you'll notice we are not talking about figures or anything like that. We're just really just trying to focus on the need. So that's the family diagram of how things look like for this family. So we've had a look at the family unit of Mr. King. He's married, he's got a wife and a daughter. Now, we're looking at his business interests. So we've got the same Mr. King. He is a 70% shareholder in a company called Zimele Pty Ltd with a value of 10 million rands. And his other shareholder in the company is Mr. Green, who's got 30% shareholding in that company. Now, it just so happens that Mr. King is also the chief programmer in the company. So let's just say maybe they are in IT. I don't even know if there's a title called chief programmer, but he knows he calls all the shots when it comes to programming and maintaining the systems that they sell to their clients. So that's the company structure. He is a husband, breadwinner. He's a family man, and he is married. Mr. King, and he's married to Mrs. King, and they're married in community of property, and they have one daughter. And that's a lovely house that they stay in still. However, on the other side, on the business side of things, Mr. King is a shareholder, and he owns 70% shares in a company called Zimele Propriety Limited with a value of 10 million rands. His other shareholder in the company is Mr. Green, who holds 30% shareholding. And it just so happens that Mr. Green is also the chief programmer in the company, which means he's quite an important person in the company. So that's the two diagrams side by side. Now, Mr. Green, you'll see with the diagrams that he plays pivotal roles both as a breadwinner in the family, and it just make it worse. So just say Mrs. King is a housewife; she's not working, so he plays quite a pivotal role in being a breadwinner in that family, and also in the company as a shareholder and the chief programmer. He's got big responsibilities. So if you take out Mr. Green out of the scene, and let's say he passes away in a car accident, so that means he's no longer a husband, he's no longer a father, he's no longer a family man, he's gone. He's also no longer a shareholder in Zimele Pty, and he's no longer a chief programmer. So those are all the different roles that he played that he no longer plays. Now, there's many problems that Mr. King's death will cause, and we'll try and unpack some of them. And I'm just going to highlight a few of them, and we'll go through them one by one. One of the first ones that is very glaring is that Mr. King has a daughter and a wife, and without him, that means there is no longer an income coming into that house. So our first problem that we're looking at when you're looking at the family unit is that there's going to be a loss of income at this point, because Mr. King is no longer alive. The second issue that we're going to be looking at is, remember that Mr. King and Mrs. King were married in community of property. So although there's been a loss of income, but at least if she could get some sort of capital from the company that Mr. King was a shareholder in, then they would at least get by in terms of surviving without Mr. King. Now, the reason I say that is, remember that with the marriage and community of property, although Mr. King owns a 70% shareholding, but by virtue of the marital regime, which is community of property, they owe everything 50-50. So in other words, indirectly, she basically owns 50% of Mr. King's 70% share in Zimele. So in essence, the 7 million rands shareholding that Mr. King holds in the company, in essence, what's happening there is that Mrs. King actually indirectly owns 3.5 million of that 7 million rands that Mr. King owns in Zimele, just by purely virtue of the marital regime. Now, this situation obviously causes many problems. First of all, if Mr. Green is not interested in having a new shareholder in the company, then he's not interested. Worst of all, Mrs. King is not even really involved. Well, not really, but she's not involved in the company in Zimele. So she doesn't know anything about the company. She's not interested. In fact, probably since the death of her husband, she just probably wants a lump sum just to take care of her, especially since they have a daughter as well. So in order to avert the problem of having the wife as part shareholder, what Mr. Green ideally wants to do is to completely buy out Mr. King's shareholding, the full 70%, so that one, he becomes the full shareholder of Zimele, the company, but number two, he's not then forced to have a new shareholder in the form of Mrs. King coming into the company because she was married in community of property. The other problem that the loss of Mr. King poses is that for the actual company, now we're not talking about the family unit anymore, nor are we talking about Mr. Green, but for the actual company, the company has a loss as well. Because remember, in this company, it's a PTY, which means it's a separate company, it's a separate legal persona. It has a loss as well. Without Mr. King being around as a chief programmer, the company has no direction really. So they've lost a key individual in the company, and how are they going to be sustainable going forward with the loss of that key individual? Let's assume, for example, Mr. Green was just more of an investor, so he just pumped in funds into the company, and although he's a director, but he manages more other things. But Mr. King was the real functional or operational person. Now, since the loss of Mr. King in Zimele, the company, Mr. Green can always try and find and raise funds in order to try and buy out Mr. King, so that he ultimately owns the company 100% and continues with the company. However, there comes some problems with that. So, for example, if he had to try and raise funds via the company, banks might turn him down and say, look, we don't have Mr. King anymore. He was the chief operating person. He was the or chief programmer. He was a key individual. We just don't believe that the company can be sustainable going forward. We know that you are still around, but you obviously didn't have a succession plan to begin with. And then secondly, I mean, he might try to raise funds on his own personal capacity. And that could be also a bit of a challenge for many reasons as well. So at that point, to try and raise funds because a death has occurred is sometimes very difficult. And now let's make the situation a bit worse. Let's say Mr. King, when he started his business, he actually made a loan to the bank and used his house as collateral. In other words, let's say he borrowed 3 million rands from the bank in order to start Zimele, the company, and he used his house as collateral. So simply put, when Mr. King wanted to start the company, he needed 3 million rands. So he approaches the bank. The bank says, we'll give you 3 million rands, but in the event that you can't pay us back or the company folds or whatever the case may be, can you pledge your house and say that if you cannot meet your obligations, then we'll come and attach your house so that we can pay the debt that you owe us. So just keeping the facts simple, assuming that Mr. King is still owing 2 million rands of that loan that he made from the bank. That means now in his passing, unless he's made provision, the bank is going to come and attach the house, and Mrs. King and the daughter will have no place to stay because the bank has to satisfy that loan that Mr. King owns, which is not somewhere you want to go to. So now with the passing of Mr. King, we sit with a couple of problems. The first one, as I mentioned, for the family, there's been a loss of income. The second problem I will sit with is Mr. Green here now needs funds to buy out Mr. King. So that's the second problem that we sit with. So Mr. Green also has a problem. The third problem is with the company itself, Zimele. The company needs to find a replacement of Mr. Green so that they can carry on with their business and become sustainable. So there's a problem there. The fourth one is that because initially when Mr. King started the company, he took out a loan with the bank and used his house as collateral. That means if there is no funds to settle that loan, that house is gone and Mrs. King and the daughter will be left homeless. So we've got 4 distinct problems that we need to deal with, and all of these can be simply dealt with using many products. One of the cheapest ones being example, life cover. So we've got to be mindful that the passing of Mr. Green has many implications for many different parties, and that's what we're going to try and manage. So then in summary, in terms of all the different needs that this scenario has created, the first one is a loss of income for the family. Now what Mr. King could have done is just simply taken out personal cover so that in his passing, the family can have some funds to survive from. The second need is the need for funds by Mr. Green to purchase Mr. King's and indirectly Mrs. King's share from the business so that he becomes the ultimate shareholder. So there we could look at a buy and sell agreement between Mr. Green and Mr. King, so that in the event of either of them dying, the one that's surviving has funds to purchase the shareholder of the deceased. The third one is that there's a need for Zimele, the actual company, to find a replacement for Mr. King, who was the key individual. So there you could look at keyman cover, for example. And then the fourth one is, remember that Mr. King had taken had used his house as collateral in order to secure some funds for the business. So there we could take out a contingent liability plan. This is all just terminology. Liability. So what that would do is, in the event of Mr. King, and there's a 2 million rand debt that we're still owing that I spoke about, in the event of his death, the life policy pays out to the bank, settles the 2 million rands, and the house is secured. Now remember, at this point we're just talking about really long-term insurance solutions, which will be using policies to solve a lot of these problems. So that's why I was harping on about the whole thing about definitions. We haven't even looked at other things. For example, the short-term insurance needs of the business. That is completely separate. So when we talk about business insurance, this is what I'm basically referring to. So I'm basically referring to life products that could be sold for personal cover, buy and sell agreements, which is life policies, contingent liability plans, and your keyman covers, which all use long-term insurance products. And it is those products, and because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to nitpick on the next following videos and go through each one of these need areas and talk about how to even design a product. Who becomes the owner of the product, who becomes the payer, and what are the different tax implications. So that there's still a whole lot of stuff to discuss, but I just thought for now we'll just use a quick snapshot just to pick up some of the problems that may arise just through the death of an individual. All right, I hope that makes sense. Like I said, it was just the highlights of identifying the different needs. We'll still definitely be going into a whole lot of detail with respect to all of these things. But I just thought I'll do a simple example and hopefully just to get those ideas going. So I'll hopefully see you in the next couple of sessions with the drilling down of the different aspects. I'll see you soon.